Morphos. Hello, my meticulous minty millipedes. Oh, do you hear that? In the distance, do you hear that? It's like a fire alarm, I think, because get ready, it's a hot take time. So first, actually, let's get this out of here. It's fragile, and this is a video about the ballad songs. So let's talk about Morphos. Ignore this. They're very sharp. Benchmade Morpho 51s, initially making their debut in 2009. They came out with a little bit of controversy in the ballad song world, at least. So, a lot of flippers initially did not care for these because they were light, they were a different balance, short-ish, and just people didn't like them at the time. However, these are the knives that got me wanting to collect way back when I first saw them. I believe it was around when they first released, maybe 2010-ish. I saw them, and I loved them. I mean, look at these things. Look at this thing. It's gorgeous. The blue titanium liners with this very nice jeweling. It's actually really nice. You can't see the grit marks from when they were doing the jeweling. And the black liners, the G10 really helps to make the blue pop, at least in person. It's hard to see on camera, but it's really nice. Ignore the latch. The latch can be taken off as well as the clip, but the rest of it is just really nice. There's something really nice about the aesthetic of it. Now, for flipping, I guess I can see why people didn't like the blade that much. It's symmetric, and now that I've gotten into flipping, I've realized that it's not good for indexing which side is the bite side and which is not. But on the handles, it's got a nice chamfer on the scales, and it makes it very comfortable when flipping. I mean, it's just very nice, actually. Now, some people say that it's a little bit short, but let's be honest, in my hand, it's kind of a normal size ballad song. Now, why is this a hot take? Because a surprising amount of people actually really hate them. Not just dislike or not to their taste, hate virulently the Morpho 51. And I don't entirely understand why it gets that kind of hate. And just for full transparency's sake, for now, so you don't yell at me later about this, I do acknowledge that there are some flaws about it, and I will get to those in the video at some point. But also, right now, I want to praise it. Look at this. They're gorgeous. Both of these are, it's just, the 51 is beautiful. Look at it. Look at it. So as mentioned before, these are the ballad songs that got me into wanting to collect these and flip these, just in general, way back when I saw them when I was little. And something about me is that ever since I was little, I've been a huge nature lover, both in terms of conservation and collecting things. And one thing I got relatively early on in my life in terms of collecting was this. This thing is old. It's actually over 20 years old. So given that I was gifted this butterfly at such a fundamental and crucial part of my life in my early childhood, this specific species and things associated with it really stick out to me. And this knife, this model is no exception. These, I might have a little bit of a bias towards loving them a bit, but I do love them still, and I can already hear some people who might be watching thinking and saying, "Oh, so clearly you have something that's making you biased towards these things and having a weird opinion about it because it actually totally sucks ass, this knife does, and your opinion is bad because it's a bad opinion." Well, that's the thing. Oh, my sloob. So that's the thing. This is not a review. This is an opinion piece. I'm gonna tell my opinion because I don't care what you think. This is my thoughts, and I'm gonna tell my opinion regardless of what you think about this knife because I love it and I want to talk about it. Let's just take this back out because clearly it's getting a little bit heated here. So clearly I have some personal biases and favoritism towards this knife, which I think is good to admit in a opinion piece because I don't think I would be very valid in my opinion if I wasn't willing to also admit that there are some clear biases going on. However, I still think, objectively, there's some merits to this ballad song, and I'm gonna go over them with you. So here's what I think about the Benchmade Morpho 51. If Benchmade were to have released these in the current day, right now, I think they would have been received so much better than they were 15 years ago when they were first released. And there's a few factors to why I think that they would have been. Now, when these were first released in that 2009 era, there were not a lot of things that people considered a good standard flipper. There were some things that people enjoyed, kind of few and far between. There was some stuff that was from Jerry Hahn that people liked, and also the Cold Steel Archangel, very expensive when they do show up. And from Benchmade themselves, the 42, a legendary ballad song, not just because it shows up in movies, or at least this handle pattern does. It's been around since long before the 42, but in a time when steel was a common material to use for the handles, this was titanium, which means it's not absurdly handle biased, and because of that, it's better balanced. And people found that it actually does things that the ballad songs of before could not. This kickstarted the flipping community somewhat because of that. Now this thing comes in at about 4 to 4.3 ounces. It can kind of vary. These weigh 3.3 ounces. They are extremely light. Now when you're jumping from that 4 to 5 ounce range all the way down to 3.3 ounces, a lot of people are probably going to react negatively because it's not what they're used to. However, in the current day, there's a lot of lighter ballad songs. Plastic, or aluminum even. A lot of ballad songs actually clock in at sub 4 ounces. And a lot of people like that because you don't get your fingers exhausted as quickly. People who like heavier ones are still around. Most of them are old school. Some of them are just people who have peculiar tastes. And that's okay. But there's a lot of people who like lighter ballad songs. In fact, there's the Gaboon, which clocks in even lighter at 3.2 ounces. And that's a modern ballad song that people kind of try to flip, and it's about the same size as these two. Point being that these, I think, would be much better received in the current day, especially for their price. When these were released, they were about $180. Benchmade now makes very expensive things. For a while there was the 6X series, like the 62, 67. Those things were very, very pricey for what they were. Steel handles, terrible balance for $400. And then they went back to titanium, but they were chunky and weird. The 8X series, they were heavy, weird, and just not good for flipping. And they came in at about $800 brand new, and that's just way too much for what they were. So given that these are lighter and better balanced than the most recent Benchmade stuff, I think that these would have been well received. Now, they did kind of reach a $300 price point, but it's still not absurd, and these sold pretty decently for the most part, for knife people at least. And some flippers actually do like them, such as myself, because, like I said, they're actually surprisingly well balanced. They are very, very neutral. I'm not going to say dead neutral, because dead neutral is very subjective, and nobody can agree what it is. But these are very close to what is considered generally neutral, which is different from the handle bias that everything used to have back in the day. And going from that kind of handle bias to this could also be a little bit jarring to people, which might be why people didn't care for it. It's also a little bit shorter, just a little bit shorter than a 42, but it's really not that much different. If you look at them right next to each other, the difference is actually pretty minuscule. It's not that much shorter than a 42. Maybe a few millimeters, 5 at best maybe, but if you look at the total length, they're actually very, very close. They're about the same length, just a couple millimeters off, but I can see how in a time when this was the normal handle biased and heavier, it was a little bit jarring for people to go to this, I'm sure, but in the current day, this is what would be considered a little bit more normal. I think that people would have loved this thing, even if it was a little bit pricey at some point. It's easy to mod it because it's a sandwich ballad song. And sandwich means you can put inserts in at the bottom to lengthen the handles if you need it. You can add weights to it. It's so versatile. People would have loved this thing, especially for the fact that it's not $800. And there were a lot of mods. There were a lot of mods for these to make them better and closer to people's tastes at the time. Some of them don't hold up so much because they are more aligned to the old stuff that wasn't always the best, but there's a lot of things that are used on these, like handle extenders, new scales, reblades even. There's a lot of things to make them better. Bushing mods. That one can be a little bit iffy, but there's a lot of things that were done to make these better-ish. They're a great platform, and unfortunately they're gone. Now I know I said I would talk about the negatives of this knife as well, And I will, because the negatives of this knife are actually pretty glaring, and most of them have to do with the material. So if you look here on the blade, it says that the material is D2. D2 is a type of tool steel, and the top grade D2 is actually semi-stainless. It's pretty rust resistant. In fact, it's generally more rust resistant than even 154 CPM, which is a stainless steel. Well, these blades were known to rust really easily. In fact, all of Benchmade's D2 blades were known to rust very easily. So whatever kind of D2 Benchmade decided to purchase, it's not top grade. It's probably the cheapest D2 they could find in the biggest bulk they could find. In fact, it was so bad that it ruined everybody's perception of D2 as a steel. People thought that D2 was awful just because Benchmade had terrible D2, and because they're such a big company, more people were able to experience the terrors of this awful D2. And good D2 is actually pretty good. Stitch Steel, maker of the Paradigm and the Alien, he used top quality D2 for his first Aliens. And they don't have this kind of rust issue that these things have, so it's clear that Benchmade decided to use the worst D2 they could find for these things, unfortunately. So another issue that people took with the 51 is its tune. Now, if I were to take something like my Machine-Wise Balisong, nothing. You hear nothing. And when you move the handles around, you just get that little bit of wiggle. Not a lot of stuff, just a little bit of wiggle. Well, let me hold the latch on this 51 a second, and yeah, they're a little bit tappy, and sometimes the blade will stick when you're opening it. That's because there's no relief here. It's just the washer giving it a little bit of space, and the rest is just flat titanium. So there's not really anything to prevent it from tapping. You literally cannot tune the tap out of this easily. You can, but then it immediately gets bad again just because of how little relief there is. Now technically, something like this, the 42, no better. Play and tap does not really change the flipping experience for the most part. It doesn't matter as much as people think it does. It's just less annoying when it's well tuned and doesn't have that noise. Because, let's be honest, when you're flipping, you're not gonna want to hear that for the most part. And unfortunately, you can't really tune these very well either, because if you want them tuned, if you want them on bushings, which is why Machine-Wise stuff is so not tappy, you're gonna have to completely surface grind the blade, because Benchmade surface grinding is awful. Very uneven, not good. That's a terrible way to make the tune. And this gripe might be a little bit smaller, but I also agree with it. These are bad T8 Torx screw heads. They strip relatively easily, and these are T6, which is worse because there's not a lot of material and they strip very easily. And there's so many screws. Look at that on both sides. There's so many. This was kind of obnoxious to take apart. It's not the worst, but there's a lot of parts here, actually. It's springy. But still, despite all those issues, I still genuinely think that it would have been so much better received if it were released today rather than 15 years ago at this price point. If it was up in the 400s, then no, definitely not. But for what they were and the price that they were released at, I actually really like these, and I still love them. They're beautiful. They have a lot of personal value to me just because it's what kickstarted me into wanting these, and I just love them. I love them a lot. So take it how you will, it's still just an opinion piece, but I really do think that it got some undue hatred just because of the time period it came out in when everything else was so much different than it. It was very different compared to everything else that was on the market, and people probably just dismissed it because it was so different from what they were used to. But it's really not bad. I really do think that if it was released today, a lot more people would love it. Maybe not love it to the point of wanting several, but I do think that a lot more people would enjoy it at least. There would still be a good modding community for it. A lot of things would be done to make it more to people's preferences, and it's really not bad just in general. It's got a decent balance. It's not the best thing I've ever touched, but it's really not that bad either. It could use a little bit more length, I guess, but it's really not that bad. But I digress. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this opinion piece, this maybe hot take, lukewarmish maybe. I don't really know where people stand on this currently, or at least I hope you enjoyed looking at these beautiful pieces. They really are pretty. Like and whatever if you want, and if you've been here this long, and I'll see you all next time.